good afternoon, everybody, and it's wonderful to have you join us. I wish I was in Colorado in person if you were joining and heard some of the chatter, but I'm here in Washington, D.C., but thrilled to join you virtually. I'm Liz Schreier. I'm the President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and we are pleased to join you in what will be a really timely discussion. The challenges before us, both here at home and globally, are quite great, both from the global pandemic to the critical conversations that are taking place literally on the corner of every one of our streets around the country on racial injustice. I want to begin by hoping that all of you and your families are safe and healthy. Today, our topic is quite, as I said, timely and important, to take a look at America's role in the world and the impact that is having not only on our national security, but our economic interests and, of course, of our values. And lucky for us, we're going to have a virtual town hall for somebody all of you know quite well. And that, of course, is your Congressman Jason Crow. He's in our Zoom room, and I'm going to introduce him formally in just a moment. A few logistics. All of you are on mute, but hopefully you will not stay quiet for much longer, because as I'm going to lead the conversation in a moment, but then I'm going to open it up for your Q&A, and I'm going to explain to you how we will do that shortly. A few comments that I'd like to make to kind of set the scene for our discussion. It's hard to believe, but our organization that's hosting this today is 25 years old this year. I will share with you that I've been thinking a lot about this date. When we formed, there are many differences and there are some similarities, because when we formed, there were some Americans that believed that it was okay to withdraw from the world, to turn inward. Now, think about the time 25 years ago was when America was just, the world was coming off of the Cold War. And some of our fellow citizens thought we won the peace dividend we could have, and therefore we don't need tools in our toolbox like the State Department, USAID, Peace Corps, and we could draw down from that engagement in the world. But we felt that was really dangerous. Certainly Representative Crow knows this well, and we'll talk about it. So we organized and said we have to push back against this. And that's your host for today, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, for the handful of you that are new for us. So your coalition that's hosting you today is a big tent. And we're known as the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. You can see by the icons that you're looking at. We're 500 businesses and NGOs, a wide range of organizations. We're proud that we're bipartisan, that we have a advisory committee that's kind of the who's who of foreign policy, former secretaries of state and defense, over 200 retired military leaders, generals and admirals. And we live in every state, and so proud to be connected for a long time in Colorado, where our honorary co-chairs are former senators Hank Brown and Gary Hart. And what brings us together is the exact topic we're going to talk about today, about the belief that America needs to be a leader in the world, and that what happens globally matters locally, that it's key to invest in things like global health, development, diplomacy, because it matters to our security and our economic interests. So lastly, what do we do? And that leads us to our discussion today. We educate and we advocate. We advocate around a little 1% of the federal budget. It's known as the International Affairs budget. Some people call it the Foreign Aid budget, but it's really so much more. A lot of you are so familiar with this because you've been active with us for years. It's about our diplomats overseas. It's our global health programs that, frankly, a lot about making sure that we can work to stop pandemics, and obviously we haven't focused and invested enough in that, and also programs that help support our economic interests at home. But the other thing that we do is we make sure we have forums like this with you, the American public. And nothing kind of speaks to this more than exactly the COVID-19, a wake-up call of how interconnected we are. So let's get into our discussion. And we have two fabulous participants in our panel. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to get into it. So Barbara Humpton is an incredible individual who's going to add enormous depth to our conversation. She is the president and CEO of Siemens USA, a member, lucky us, of our USGLC National Board of Directors. At Siemens, she leads over 50,000 employees just in the United States. And I could tell you that she is a sought-after voice when it comes to innovation, advancing healthcare needs all the way to expanding access to energy. And she's going to add to our conversation multiple parts, but particularly about that economic connection to America's leadership in the world. Now, the other featured speaker is someone, as I said, you all know well, your Congressman, Representative Jason Crow, who I know and I've watched, who has been out on the front lines, making sure since the day COVID-19 hit our shores, has been working on your behalf. He may be a freshman, but he is truly an expert on national security and foreign policy, having served as a U.S. Army Ranger and 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, traveling the globe and understanding firsthand what it means for America to be engaged in the world. I have seen since the day he landed in Washington, even though I knew him before as he served on USGLC's Colorado Advisory Committee, that he has really brought those skills and those ideas to Washington, serving on the House Armed Services Committee, and really bringing that understanding to our issues. He has chaired and led letters, issues to the front line, and in fact, so much so that we had honored him along with many of his veteran leaders in something we've never done, which is to honor a whole group of veterans for their leadership as a caucus called the 4-Country Caucus, a group of veterans who felt it was so important, bipartisan Democrats and Republicans, who showed their commitment to America's global leadership. Last thing I would say is introducing Congressman Crow, is I have watched, and there's not many members that this is true about, but that members from Democrats and Republicans, Congressman, when you speak, your colleagues listen to you, particularly when it comes to national security. We look forward to learning from you. We look forward to talking with you. Welcome, Congressman Jason Crow, to the conversation. How are you, and how is your family during all of this unsettling time?
Hi, Liz. Thank you. Good to be with you. My family is doing well. We are healthy. We're safe. My wife and I are learning how to homeschool our children. Some days are certainly better than others. And I had a lot of respect for our teachers before, but boy, do I have a lot of respect for our teachers now. It's a hard job, but you know, we're very fortunate as we're healthy and doing well. So it's really good to be with you, and good to be with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition again, and to be with Barbara Humpton as well, a tremendous leader in the business community, to be talking about these issues.
Great. Well, I know you're going to kick this off by saying a few words to kind of set the stage, and then I'll come back and moderate the conversation. So all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. So thank you again for having me and for putting this together. I would just like to start with a very simple proposition. And that proposition for me, the guiding principle, is that America is safer and more prosperous when we are engaged with and when we are leading in the world. You know, this idea that we can build figurative walls, that we can isolate ourselves from the rest of the world, and that would make us prosperous and more safe, is just not true. We've seen that in history. We've seen that over time, that isolationism, strands of nationalism, and whether it's America or other places, when you retreat inwards, it doesn't turn out well. We've seen that in history. You know, and the post-World War II era, where the United States really has stood up and helped to create institutions to create peace and prosperity throughout the world, has been one of the safest periods in human history, and also been one of the most prosperous periods of human history. But we're really challenged right now. We're challenged as people are reassessing the role of democracy worldwide. They're reassessing the role of engagement. The pace of change is faster than it has ever been. We're looking at globalization, the IT revolution, social media, all of these things that have come onto the world stage and have drastically reshaped our economy in the last 2 decades, provide great opportunity, but they also provide great challenge because they leave certain people behind. We haven't done a good job of bringing vast numbers of our population along with those changes and addressing folks' education needs and job transition needs, and that has created a lot of tension. So really looking at 2 different frames. One is the national security frame. You look at the multiple challenges that we face. Now, America has faced a lot of challenges before, but never before have we faced as many challenges that are as quickly evolving and transitory as they are right now. From security threats in the Korean Peninsula, which just this week continue to heighten, to China and India challenges, to issues facing Israel and annexation, to issues in Eastern Europe with Russian aggression. And then you compound that with entirely new arenas of challenges involving social media by state and non-state actors and manipulation in our democracies. So what all of this means is we have to stay engaged and we have to lead. And if we want a leadership in a national security environment that's based on our values, the values of democracy, freedom, transparency, and accountability, then we have to lead. Because if we don't, then those nations that do not share those values will step into our shoes and will create a very different world and a very different environment for our children. Now, on the prosperity front, the members of this coalition understand that if we want a good business environment, that means safety and stability and predictability. You know, for almost a decade, I was a business lawyer and I helped small and medium-sized businesses deal with complicated regulatory issues. And one of the biggest challenges is predictability. And if you have an environment that's not predictable on the world stage, it's very hard to do business and it's very hard to create jobs. And that's one of the things that the members of this coalition know so well. And that's another reason why we need to engage. And here in Colorado, it's very important because we export about $8.5 billion a year from Colorado to foreign partners. So it's a huge component of our economy. And we have about almost $500 million a year of direct cash investment and benefit to our economy from the many worldwide students that come to study at our world-class universities here as well. So it's a critical part of our economy, and we have to make sure that we have the security and the stability to facilitate those type of investments. And then lastly, before we engage in a conversation here, the pandemic that we're facing is the perfect illustration for worldwide engagement. The coronavirus doesn't care about boundaries. It doesn't care about borders. It doesn't care about political issues, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. All it cares about is its ability to spread and to take lives and to upend our economy. So there's no greater need right now for international cooperation, where we need to be sharing information about this virus. We need to have our doctors and our researchers and scientists collaborating with all countries that have information about how this virus is spreading and adapting. And we need to be collaborating through the World Health Organization and other institutions to rapidly develop treatments and a vaccine. This has to be done with international cooperation, and we cannot retreat from those bodies and that type of cooperation going forward.
Terrific. Great opening. And now I get to throw out a lot of questions. I'm going to invite Barbara in a moment, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So we're going to focus on what matters abroad, how it impacts us locally. And the title for this conversation is, as I said, you know, what happens globally matters locally. But I'm going to start a little bit different place because, like all of us, I've been watching how many citizens around the world have joined in solidarity with American citizens as they have been watching Americans stand up and speak out and raise their voices about racial unrest. And so I'm going to flip it a little bit just before we get into the discussion of our topic about what do you think about how what's happening locally is impacting America globally? So let's just start as a little bit different place, and then we'll get into the original conversation. Congressman.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right in that our our moral leadership is frankly one of our most powerful forms of leadership. You know, our alliances and our partnerships are not based on coercion. They're not transactional. They never have been. Of course, we have economic transactions and we have ties that are really important. But our alliances and our leadership is based on our moral leadership and our values. The fact that we believe in democracy, the fact that we believe in a free market, that we believe in transparency and accountability, that we believe in these international markets, and that they are better for the world and they're better for our communities. And that the more transparency and accountability that you have, the better. And you know, to the extent that we turn away from a values-based relationship and alliances to a transactional relationship, we're in a much better place or worse place. Now, I have been very concerned about the extent to which some of the world is turning away from us and they're moving on without us because of our failure to lead in so many ways. But what we've seen recently, and I've actually been encouraged, we're obviously going through a very challenging time as a country and dealing with the systematic racism and the institutional racism that has plagued our country for hundreds of years. And we have an opportunity and a moment in time now to deal with this and to push that action forward. And we have to have those tough conversations. But one of the things that I've seen that has actually been encouraging out of this is the extent to which the world has followed our lead. You know, as we saw peaceful protests in cities across the nation, as people standing up and demanding change and demanding reform, rightfully so, they've done it around the world too. And these protests spread. And that's our moral leadership. People still look to America. They still look to us. And they still look at us as a guiding light. And it's been incredibly encouraging for me to see that over the last couple of weeks. And I think it's a great example of our influence in a positive, values-based way.
Great way to lead. Barbara, come on into the Zoom room and let's start focusing a little deeper on COVID-19. So as Barbara's coming in, there she is. Welcome, Barbara. So this is Barbara Humpton, everybody. So here's where I want to start. Why we're in the Zoom room. We're in here because of a global pandemic. So I'm going to show a video, and then I'm going to ask you both a question on the flip side. So ladies and gentlemen, take a look at this.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
So you probably have seen that over the last few months. That was Bill Gates 5 years ago. And we, the collective we, didn't listen. Now, Congressman, starting with you, you were singing off that same song sheet. You've been talking, and you've been talking a lot over the last 3 months about we need to be investing not only here, but overseas. We need to have a much greater U.S. global response because 70% of the world's health systems are not ready to detect, respond, or prevent a pandemic. You have a bill that focuses on biodefense. You have been front and center of this. What should we be doing to not only be dealing globally on this pandemic, but a future one? Congressman Crow.
Well, we need to restructure certain parts of our government to actually be agile and nimble and deal with this. I think one of the things we've seen is that we weren't ready at any level within the United States government to deal with this. And that includes the institution of the US Congress, that includes the executive branch, that includes the military. We were not trained and structured to do it. So one of the things that my bill does, which is a bipartisan bill, along with Ms. Stefanik from New York, a fellow member of the Intelligence and Emerging Threats Committee that I sit on, we have come together and said that we need better interagency cooperation, better information sharing, that we need to set our agencies up to be quicker and more agile and to respond faster. The other thing we need to do is look at a restructuring, because we are not designed, we don't have the institutions in place to deal with a pandemic. Now we have the Department of Homeland Security, which is predominantly a law enforcement organization. DHS, that has the jurisdiction to respond to crises within the United States, is predominantly a law enforcement organization because it arose after 9/11, and it has that type of culture. Now we have FEMA, and FEMA does disaster response, but it's largely a regional-based disaster response organization, and it's not a cabinet-level position. So it's very good at dealing with earthquakes, fires, floods, hurricanes, and tornadoes at regional levels, where you take resources from one region and you flex that into resources to another region. But when you're dealing with a crisis that is everywhere in every region, we don't have the organization and entity set up. So we have to elevate FEMA. We have to create a non-law enforcement crisis response organization. And then we have to re-engage with WHO and other international bodies to share information.
So Barbara, Siemens has been leaned in big time globally. You have advanced medical technology. You've expanded hospital infrastructure. You have Siemens healthineers that have literally gone out into some of the developing world to help respond to the virus. Why is it so important, just as the congressman says, that the U.S. kind of leans in globally?
I'm so glad you asked this question, Liz. And Liz, thanks for including me in this conversation. And Congressman, thank you so much for your leadership on these topics. This matters now more than ever. And why is it important that we think globally as the US? Well, I think what we're seeing is exactly as the congressman said, we're all human. This is a pandemic affecting all of us. I'd like to believe that the lesson we've learned from this is that we're in it together. We've heard that slogan, rallying around communities, et cetera. But what's so clear is that we're all, regardless of the location around the world, we're all wrestling with this and entering the curve, exiting the curve at different times. Something we learned as Siemens early on in the crisis, this obviously hit China first, and we have operations there. We were able to learn from our colleagues in China. How did they respond? And then we took those lessons learned, and we've had a really robust response around the world. But what we've discovered is it's hyper-local. And so what we need is not so much centralized command and control, but resources, knowledge, frameworks that we can use to empower local leaders in order to make decisions. Take that on a corporate level where we've got 380,000 employees worldwide, but expand that concept to what we're dealing with truly as global leaders. And you realize we have a huge role to play, sharing knowledge, sharing capabilities, and then helping to treat the world, because there is no one who is exempt, just as the congressman said in his opening comments.
So I'm going to drill down a little bit more on what each of you have said, and I want to do kind of a lightning round of a couple issues of what the risks are if we don't do this. And I want to start with national security. Congressman, you know this well. You know this from your work on Armed Services Committee, your life as an Army Ranger. We are already seeing the Pentagon say that there's a likely resurgence of ISIS in Syria. We are seeing almost a 40% increase in sub-Saharan Africa of attacks going on there. The list goes on. How worried are you of the destabilizing impact of the pandemic, particularly in fragile states, probably particularly in the Middle East, where we are terribly concerned, and commented of it given your expertise?
I'm gravely concerned about that, because in my experience, and I used to be an Army Ranger, as you know, Liz, and I served 3 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in all my interactions with folks in Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the things that it pointed out to me was the inherent limitations of military power, because a lot of what drives radicalization and involvement and recruiting to terrorist organizations is a lack of basic services. It's kind of goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When people are hungry, when they're sick, when they don't have access to clean water, when they're unemployed, they turn to other avenues, and they turn to other groups that don't lead them in a good direction. And what's happening now is not only are we dealing with the pandemic, but we're dealing with the consequences of a pandemic, which are going to be with us for years ahead. And that's not just economic. Last week I had a discussion with the director of the World Food Program, and he told me a shocking statistic. He said about a year ago there were 80 million people around the world that were on the verge of famine, starvation. As of today, there are about 260 million people, right? So in a matter of a year, the number of people that are facing famine and starvation has gone up many times, fold, right? So if people are hungry, if they don't have food, that drives refugee movements, that's population displacements, that means radicalization. It could mean the fall of nation states, and it could completely change the landscape of the world in the security and the diplomatic and the economic environment that we face for decades to come. And that's why we have to be bold. We have to be aggressive in dealing with this, and we have to be leaning in as a country on the world stage and not retreating inward.
So we could do a lot more in national security, but I want to switch to economics, also a concern. We are looking at 40 million Americans probably rising in terms of unemployment. IMF is coming out with new predictions tomorrow, but they have already said over the next 2 years, we're talking about $9 trillion loss in GDP. Barbara, my question is 50% of U.S. exports go to emerging markets. We are seeing those markets devastated by the pandemic, places like Latin America, Africa, South Asia. You have big exports in those regions. Make the connection of how concerned you and your fellow CEOs are about what happens when those markets crumble due to the pandemic and what that means to our economy.
Well, that's right. I mean, the majority of U.S. produced goods and services are sold overseas, right? That's a stretch, but the majority of potential customers are out there. And the real issue is that if they don't have the wherewithal to participate in the global economy, then we won't have access to that, right? What we've seen over these last few decades is just unprecedented growth in global security and prosperity. The two go hand in hand, as we've been saying. And you've seen this healthcare crisis evolve into an economic crisis, sort of revealing the underlying social issues we're dealing with ourselves. Imagine this playing out in region after region around the world. One of the things we focus on as Siemens, most people who know us as an infrastructure company. And one of our main core capabilities is in electrification. We've been huge proponents of bringing power to underserved areas of the world. Actually exporting right from our Charlotte Energy Hub here in North Carolina and providing service from our team in Orlando, Florida. We've got tons of energy expertise in Colorado. These are the people who are serving the world, bringing electrification. Now, just think about what we've gone through in these last 3 months. If we had shut down the US and if the lights had gone out, right? That's how much of the world must live today. I'm a big proponent. If you can get power and communications anywhere in the world, then those residents can become players in the global economy. And so that we're going to need to focus first on infrastructure in order to assure that people have the basic ability to lift themselves up and be involved in positive pursuits on a global level, instead of being forced into what are initially survival tactics and then desperation tactics.
That connects so much to one more economic question I want to ask the Congressman. You serve on the House Small Business Committee, which is very connected to what Barbara just said. You have worked a lot to focus on Colorado small business. Of the about 6,000 businesses that export in Colorado, 90% of them are small businesses. So how do you connect to what Barbara just said about making your own concern about these emerging markets, again, collapsing, economically from the pandemic and what you need to do to help take care of the small businesses and the large businesses, but particularly the small businesses in Colorado.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Colorado is a small business state. I represent a small district, small business district, and I'm gravely concerned about that too. I mean, I'm losing hair at an exponential rate, Liz, because there's so much to be concerned about and keeping me awake at night these days. But the small business component is another one of those. You know, one of the things that we're trying to work and respond to very quickly on the Small Business Committee is trying to get as much cash support to these small businesses as possible, because when these mom and pop shops close, whether it's the bakery in your corner, the restaurant, the auto shop, they don't open back up. They're gone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not like you close a franchise location and then you wait a year or two and then you open back up. These businesses are gone and we lose them. So that's why it's really important we prevent them from closing their doors and we keep them alive to get out of the other side of this hole. Because the other thing that we see is a lot of innovation in America comes from our small and medium-sized businesses. You know, I have a medical campus in my district that's the largest private employer, and there's biotechnology, there's pharmaceutical research, there's a lot of small and medium-sized startup companies that are doing incredible research and innovation, and a lot of these breakthroughs are coming from small and medium-sized businesses. So not only are we going to lose the economic engine for these businesses, but I'm also very concerned for the loss of the innovation that would come out of these, because we don't know what we will lose. We'll just lose these businesses, and then we won't get the innovations and the breakthroughs that they could ultimately provide to us, and whether it's in cancer research, technologies, robotics, what have you. So we have to make sure we're addressing this and we're getting our arms around it, and we're doing it very quickly. And that's why things like the Emergency Disaster Loan Program, the PPP program, and these others that we're working on reforming and making better are so very critical here.
So let me do one more kind of risk of not engaging, and then I'm going to open it up. Let me just remind everybody how you can ask a question. Down on your screen, or if you're on the iPad, probably up in your corner, there's a Q&A icon. You can type it in. If you want to ask a question verbally, which we'd welcome, there's a participant button, and you can literally raise your blue hand, and I'll get my attention. If you're calling in by phone, *9. Last question. You talked about values, Congressman, at the beginning, our moral leadership. You mentioned what Governor David Beasley, head of the World Food Program, he said 100% increase on the people at risk of starvation. One more stat that I want to ask you about. There are over 70 million people that are displaced in the world, and we're seeing COVID now show up in places like the Rohingya refugee camp. These are places, there's no place to wash your hands. There's no place to do social distancing. This is of great concern, and I know you have led on this. So when you think about these growing refugee challenges, these growing humanitarian challenges, famine, what is it that we need to do to take care of just the humanitarian toll on our fellow humans?
The immediate need is so great right now. I talked about the famine element, talked about the health and disease element, the displacements, the refugee movements that not only cause security challenges, but political challenges. You see the reverberating effects throughout Europe in the political instability because of the mass movements of refugees from the Middle East into Europe. So it has a lot of consequences. I'll just put a really fine point on it. I have young kids, a 7-year-old and 10-year-old kid. The world is now a small place, whether it's the transmission of diseases, whether it's security challenges, whether it's how tied our economies are. The destiny and the future of my children is tied to the destiny and future of a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old in one of those refugee camps. It's not different. And either we lead, make sure that people aren't hungry, that they're safe and secure, or we're going to have to deal with the consequences of it. We can't hide from it. We can't run from it. General and then Secretary Mattis put a really fine point on that as well. And he said, if you cut the foreign aid budget, you're going to have to buy me more ammo. That's a different way of looking at it. Either we make these investments now on the front end and we do it in a smart and strategic way, or we're going to be paying a lot more on the back end for the consequences of inaction and neglect. And I'm somebody that likes to make smart, strategic, smaller investments on the front end instead of paying 10 times more on the back end dealing with a crisis. Because we all know, whether you're in business or law or politics or in the nonprofit sector, we all know that crisis is a lot more expensive. So why don't we do the smart thing and deal with things before they become a crisis?
I love when our policymakers speak up like that. And what I also love is when our private sector speak up like this. Barbara, you and I were on a panel about a year ago in person, and you said the following to me, which I love. A company that doesn't bring value to society shouldn't exist. As I said, you have leaned in. You have launched a $100 million anti-corruption initiative. You have worked in expanding access to electricity in countries like Peru, Egypt, and Afghanistan. Why are you the private voice to what Congressman Crow just said is the public voice?
Well, first of all, Liz, thank you for remembering our business to society message. You know, a lot of companies are business to consumer, others are business to business. We think of ourselves as business to society and really serving societies with the technology and our know-how. You know, the people of Siemens are people. And our citizens across the United States are makers, we're doers, right? We are people who think about how to get things done. And I truly believe, I'm an optimist, I get it. We're in a period of disruption, but this disruption can make us stronger. And I think that business and government working together to solve issues, it actually gets, in our business, it gets our employees engaged in ways that keep them from being anxious, to keep them from focusing on their own problems. They're focused on helping the world. And then likewise in government, looking to our government to set the conditions that enable us to be focused on the things that create versus the things that destroy. I think this is a moment when I'm looking for like-minded leaders who are looking to build a more positive future. I want to work together with them to create, and hence I've loved this discussion. Thank you, Congressman.
Fantastic discussion so far. There are a ton of questions. I'm trying to capture them all, and I have a first one from John Brackney, who's going to take himself on mute, but I already see questions about the role of China, the disproportionate impact of women overseas, student visas, and how to get students here. But John, why don't you go first, and we'll try to get as many as we can. So as many quick answers as you can, we'll get them in. We've got about 20 minutes. So John, you're up.
Cool. Congressman Crow, thank you so much. Nice to see you again, and nice to see you, Liz. So as you remember, I'm a Colorado National Guardsman, or was for 12 years, and also was an Arapahoe County Commissioner for 2 terms. So I've had the great privilege of serving overseas in a civil military emergency management role in Eastern Europe, and I've done medical readiness training exercises in South America. And I've seen firsthand how important the more soft skill set of humanity means more than the uniform and the M16 I was carrying. Thank you for your leadership in a nonpartisan way. There's one I have to study a little bit more, but it's called the 4-Country Caucus. Thank you for that. But I think the important part of it is bringing together nonpartisan people together to solve problems internationally and also help our reputation. My question is this, and it sounds like a puff softball question, but it's actually a hardball question. And Barbara, I really appreciate your comments. You might want to add in on the end of this too.
John, I'm going to have to push you to get to the question.
Here's the question. How do we encourage nonpartisan, real nonpartisan problem solving to help organizations like USGLC and our role in America and around the world? How do we really do this when it seems like everybody hates each other?
All right,
yeah,
that's a good one.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to take one more, but take that. Take that one, and then we'll take 2 together the next time. Go ahead. No,
yeah,
go ahead.
I believe, I'm a firm believer in building trust. And you do it through action and working together. And you can start small, right? You don't have to take on the biggest challenges right away. So what I think we need to do is we need leaders who are willing to reach across the aisle, and I'm just going to speak from my perspective as a member of Congress, who are willing to reach across the aisle and say, you know what, we don't agree on everything. That's never been the promise. That's never been the way our system works. You know, there's no organization in the world that exists in politics or outside of politics where there's a requirement that you agree on everything to work together. It's just not the way the world works. But you can kind of come across, and that's why I love the Four Country Caucus, because we say we're all veterans, we all served our country. We're not going to question each other's patriotism and love for the country. We're going to say, you know, where's that 10%, 20%, 30% where we can find common ground and work together and build trust. And that's why so many of my bills have been bipartisan bills where I found somebody I can work with on the other side on an area of common interest. And that's how it starts. You start small and you can build, and over time, then you can tackle the larger things.
Great. Debbie Brown was next on my sheet. You take yourself on mute. You are
Liz,
up.
that one's a written question. She submitted it.
Oh, okay. Let me go to Julia because I did not see that. So I'll read Debbie your question in a moment. So Julia Kennedy, why don't you go ahead while I read Debbie's, and then I'll get it.
Hello, I'm Julia Kennedy.
You're live.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Great.
Go ahead.
Good. I'm the development director at the Posner Center in Denver. And we've got 200 organizations there, NGOs and social impact organizations working around the world. And we're all very alarmed by the humanitarian crises that we see being brought on by the pandemic. You know, Representative Crow, you mentioned Director Beasley and what's happening with starvation and poverty, but it's in health, it's in education, overall income levels, especially in our vulnerable communities that we serve. Even the UNDP says that overall development's going to fall for the first time in 3 decades. So a lot of work that we in the sector and at the Posner Center have been doing for years seems to be threatened that we're going to be going backwards. And I was hoping that you and maybe Barbara, you also could comment a little more on what can we do? You talked about investment, Barbara, you talked about infrastructure, but what can we do to make sure we don't go backwards and that we can actually sustain the advancement and progress that we've made and not go back 10, 15 years in terms of overall human development?
Great question. Congressman, you want to kick that one off, and then Barbara, you should weigh in on that.
Sure, I'd love to give, I'm happy to answer, but I'd love to give Barbara a first cut at one as well. So Barbara, if you wanted to kick us off, it'd be great to hear your response.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? As I think the business community, you've heard really take a stand this year about the role we play with stakeholders beyond shareholders. And I think there's a lot that we can do as a business community, speaking through leadership there, to address the key societal issues that need to be addressed. One of the things that has struck me about the pandemic is that, again, it's created a sense of being hyper local, right? We needed local leadership to respond to various issues. I think there's an opportunity here to ensure that we continue to care about one another. Now, what I'm hoping is that organizations are doing what Liz has been doing. She was one of the first to reach out during the pandemic and say, I know we can't meet the way we normally do, but there are tools we can use to meet. So she's kept us connected as a community. She's kept us productive and relevant. So I think that for organizations who meet critical societal needs, using your voice right now, not stepping aside and saying, I'll step in later, but being active, drawing people to your mission, now's a moment. And I think we can realign some resources pretty rapidly in this moment of disruption.
Yeah, Julia, thanks for the question, and thanks for your work at the Posner Center. Yeah, really fantastic work, and I appreciate everything that you do. I think my answer to this is going to be pretty simple. It's doing what we're doing right now, and that is we actually have to make the case, right? I think that sometimes we assume that people understand the importance of foreign engagement and foreign aid and diplomacy and development. But for almost 30 years since the end of the Cold War, we haven't been making the case as much as we need to, and that's why USGLC and leadership from folks like Barbara and our business leaders is so important. We just have to beat the drum as much as possible so people understand the consequences. People understand the interconnectedness, and that we're talking about it, because there's a lot of people who are very tired too of 20 years of war. That's the other thing that we're battling here is, the United States has been at war for almost 2 decades. We've lost thousands of lives. Tens of thousands of Americans have had their lives completely altered and changed. And we've spent trillions of dollars. And there's a lot of people who rightfully are sitting back and saying, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And why after 20 years? So, we have to be smart about it. We have to make the case, and we have to build a coalition. Frankly, outside of politics, I think we're at a moment where trust with elected officials is very low, and we have to rebuild trust by actually responding to the will of the people and doing our jobs and doing it well. But there's a really important role here for non-elected leaders, our business leaders, our nonprofit leaders, and others to be making the case too, because trust is in many cases higher for those folks in this environment. So everybody needs to be making the case all of the time.
So there were a couple questions that I'm going to combine that a lot of people were asking that I'd love both of your take on. One was about China and the role of China that has been out there. I mean, leaving aside what happened in early January, where there's a lot of conversations about, but they're out there. They're out there competing against us, and there's a concern about, are we out there enough? And what that means for our economy, what that means for our values. So I'd like both of your take on that. And another question that a number of people have asked in different ways is that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted certain populations. Women, particularly overseas, that's having a real impact. And here in our own society, it's impacting minorities. And we're seeing that day in and day out. So maybe, Barbara, you could start the conversation about China. You said, Siemens is there, but what you're seeing in terms of the competitive playing field, and Congressman, maybe about, the disproportionality, but you may want to also comment on China. Barbara, why don't you start on the China one?
Yeah, Siemens has been in the US for 160 years, right? And then Siemens is in 190 countries around the world. By the way, the US is our largest market. It's where we do 25% of all of our business worldwide. So we have this really unique role within the corporation. China, less than half, China's Siemens business is less than half of what we have here in the US. But we've seen over the years so many of the things that we hear people talking about in the news. The ownership of intellectual property is an issue, the requirements to do business with state-owned entities, all of these things. What Siemens has chosen to do is to be local in every country. And so, as I address issues in the US, I'm working with a US supply base, et cetera, et cetera. And then likewise in China, we've established this business. Now, as a citizen, I'm also engaged in activities like this, where we're very concerned about the idea that there's a great power competition, whether it's brewing or whether it's actually underway. People talk about trade war, and I'm looking at the situation and going, it is absolutely true that we need to get the right balance of trade around the world, and that's going to be difficult to get through. And I actually think that we're at a point where we need the whole world to be innovating. But what we don't need is for the US and China to be squabbling for territory, if you will, around the world, looking for influence. I'll just speak as a private citizen, the thing I'm interested in is seeing other countries emerge, stand on their own feet, and it's not a question of do they need to lean on China or lean on the US. I'd love for them to be able to draw on resources from both countries.
Congressman?
Yeah, I'll address the China one very briefly, and I might have a slightly different take from Barbara, although I think we're coming at it from generally the same direction. I do believe that China is a major threat. I do believe we're in the era of great power competition. And here's why. Because what China wants and what the United States and our allies want are two very different things. We want a rules-based international order where there's fairness, there's transparency, where there are laws and rules and regulations that make sure there's a level playing field for everybody to compete, and where the free market can thrive. That's what the U.S. wants. China doesn't want that. China wants to kind of remake the rules of the road. They want kind of power and coercion to be the thing that dominates, and I think that's problematic. Now we need to address that. I don't think we address that by starting trade wars. I think we will be on the losing end of that, and I think really nobody wins, right? I think both sides lose. What makes us unique is that the United States has allies and friends. That's one of our biggest differentiators. We have a lot of friends and alliances, and people want to engage with us because we want to engage on a level playing field with them. And there's a lot of people who are yearning in the Pacific Rim and in Asia for our re-engagement, who want us to come there and develop bilateral trade agreements and have a presence, because it's in all of our mutual interests. So that's the direction I think we need to go. And then Liz, on the last part about the disparities that the pandemic has highlighted, absolutely. What crisis does, what any crisis does, whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster or a war, is it exacerbates existing inequalities. So inequalities in education, in healthcare, in racial outcomes, in law enforcement, all of that is made worse and exacerbated by the crisis of a pandemic. And it highlights a lot of these things that we saw before in our society. So what the opportunity is for us to have a really hard conversation as a society and as government leaders and private leaders about what we do about it. Now that we have seen all of these inequalities on full display, and they've been highlighted by this crisis, there's an opportunity for us to do some bold things to make sure we're addressing them and that we're creating a more just and equitable society.
When you think about it, Debbie Brown, I missed her question when I read, but she's from the Colorado Business Roundtable. I'm going to take her question and just expand it a little, building on what you just said, is how important is it in finding these solutions that we've been talking about, a lot of the challenges that are facing it? Is this relationship between the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector in working together to grapple it? And are we doing it well enough? Barbara?
Not yet. And by the way,
Not yet.
It starts from a personal perspective, right? I mean, what's hard about these issues is that I don't care if you're talking about the whole United States or if you're talking about a city, if you're talking about a business, and I'll tell you that I've even had stories from our shop floor, right? Take just a single location, and what you'll find is where you gather together more than two individuals, you're gonna have differences of opinion and philosophies and all that kind of stuff. So for us to cultivate the ability to first listen, understand, help create plans regardless of different perspectives, and get things done. You know, the best thing that has always helped us throughout our American history is having a goal. We work very well together when we are unified against a common enemy, or when we are working toward a common objective. Let's start that dialogue of getting the discussion right about what our objectives are. Then we can put our shoulder to the wheel together, regardless of backgrounds, and like the caucus the congressman is part of, get things done in a bipartisan way.
Yeah, that is. So let me ask you both one kind of closing question. So we're talking about some pretty challenging, big challenges, a global pandemic. We started, Congressman, a conversation about racial injustice that is literally captured the energy in every street corner of our country and across the globe. I know both of you, and you both are very optimistic individuals who have put your heart and soul into now public service as a leader in the private sector. So you've traveled the world, both of you. Right now you're stuck in your basement, the congressman said, and in home, but you're trying to make a difference in the world. Can you share with us what you see, what you're seeing in the world that is giving you optimism that even though there are such tough challenges, that that this is hopefully going to bring some positive in the world? Barbara, can you kick that off?
Let me kick that off because I can share with you what I've seen: ingenuity, right? Pose a problem, tell people we've got to solve this, and man, the world rallies. Think about the fact that from the time the coronavirus DNA was released, made available to the public, medical institutions, bioscience field came together and started working immediately toward a vaccine. Companies are saying they're going to make it available for free, right? Other institutions are stepping in and providing food and shelter and things. People realizing that we have the wherewithal to solve major problems. Ingenuity is what gives me hope.
Congressman.
I agree with Barbara on that. The innovation and the ingenuity that we are seeing and the people stepping up is really amazing. I mean, I've seen it in my community where businesses are actually helping each other out and supporting each other with supply chain. We have small banks and credit unions that are giving forbearance to their customers, people that are just trying to do the right thing and find their way through it. As you said, Liz, I'm an optimist. That's not always an easy place to be, and particularly right now. Sometimes my optimism gets challenged, like everybody, but I'm still an optimist, and here's why. I mean, I've traveled the world. I've been to war many times. I've seen the best in people and I've seen the worst in people, and yet still I come to a conclusion that I believe in humanity. I believe that people are generally good. I believe that when the conditions exist for people to prosper, they will. All things being equal, humanity prevails and people will do the right thing. That's not to undersell or discount the bad things in the world, but it's just too easy to become jaded and too easy to focus on the bad things because of social media that drives discussion on the fringes, that elevates the loudest voices and the extremes on both sides, when really the vast majority of people are just in the middle, trying to raise their families, trying to build businesses, trying to do the right thing and be good neighbors. So that's what, when you put down Facebook in your iPhone and you actually sit down with somebody, and I know we have to do this virtually now, but when we get to sit down over a beer or at a barbecue, or you actually reach across and talk to somebody, it's amazing how our shared humanity comes out, and we have a lot more in common than maybe some of our differences would suggest. And that's what keeps me going.
Hear, hear. It is an honor to get to visit with both of you. And our 1-minute closing is going to be done by my colleague, our director from our Western region, J.M. Asianzo. J.M.
Thanks, Liz. And thanks, Barbara and Congressman Crow. Congressman Crow, also thanks to your amazing staff, both on Capitol Hill and the district who helped us make this happen. And thanks to our advisory committee members, our Veterans for Smart Power. Thank you very much for your service and your continued engagement. And thanks to the many more folks who joined the call today, but also stay engaged with USGLC. I want to thank folks for staying engaged with Congressman Crow throughout the pandemic, especially to drive home how important these issues are. And Congressman, thank you for encouraging us to make the case. That's what we try to do. That's what we're going to continue to try to do. Barbara, thank you as well for reiterating for us why this is not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. So folks, please stay engaged with us. I'll be in touch with all of you. We need to continue to encourage Congress to provide a stronger US-led global response for the pandemic. And I know we're going to be able to do it. So folks, thanks very much. Stay safe and talk soon.
Thank you all. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Barbara. Be well, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Barbara. Everyone be safe.
Thank you, Congressman. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Be well.